And take your Bibles, turn with me to John's Gospel, chapter number 19. John's Gospel, chapter number 19. Here's a little church trivia for you. The Apostles' Creed is one of the earliest recorded confessions of the church. And you've probably heard it repeated in various forms, even if you haven't been a part of a liturgical church in your life. From time to time, we even sing a song that's based on it. Within it, all three members of the Godhead are mentioned individually: Father, Son, Holy Spirit. However, here's your trivia. Within it, there are two specific humans that are mentioned. One of them is Mary, because Jesus was born of a virgin. But within that creed, that ancient creed, only one more human is mentioned. Da-na-na-na-na-na. His name is Pilate. That Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate and was crucified. Now, there's been a lot of debate actually throughout human history as to why Pilate was mentioned by name. Let's be honest. Why not say that he was delivered by Caiaphas, or he was betrayed by Judas, or he was denied by Peter? Why single out Pilate? Friends, I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Pilate gets the most text in the four Gospels to describe what he did and the role he played in the process. But regardless of why, over the years, Pilate has become the human face of the most profound miscarriage of justice that was Jesus' death. And his role in these moments has made him an easily recognizable figure, even if you're unfamiliar with Christian history or much of the Bible story. People will still recognize Pilate. And we're going to take a closer look at him today. We need to begin by remembering what just happened, what we looked at last week in John's Gospel, chapter number 18, where we described the unlawful, dishonest, middle of the night, without decorum, religious sham trial that Jesus endured. But at the end of that, he was brought to Pilate so that Pilate, under the authority of Rome, could sentence him to die, and not just die any death, but to die by crucifixion. Pilate interrogated him and then sent him off to Herod because he didn't want to get involved. And Herod played with him like a carnival sideshow for a little while and then sent him back to Pilate. And Pilate, at the end of chapter 18, the end of verse 38, he declared this: listen, I find no guilt in him. That's Pilate's judgment. I find no guilt in him. He tried to distract the religious leaders and the crowds with Barabbas, but to no avail. The crowd wanted Jesus to die. And Pilate knew it was a miscarriage of justice. He knew it was. Yet, he didn't follow his conscience, whatever conscience he had. He showed himself to be a man with no character. No real sense of justice or even honesty. He made decisions that were politically expedient. Look with me in chapter 19 as it begins. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. One of the things that you're going to notice as we progress through this story about the last moments of Jesus' life. We're in his last day. We're approaching the last few hours that he lives, and Jesus is going to be dead and buried by dark. One of the things that you're going to notice is if you're anything like me, your imaginations have a tendency to run wild with thoughts of the particulars of his torture. And I'm not criticizing that. I think it's good for us to look into everything that happened to him so that we could be forgiven. It's a good thing. Just notice this with me. The biblical writers didn't spend any ink on it. So much happened here in verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. In Roman culture, there were 3 specific types of punishments that were known by this word flogging. One of them was, I wouldn't say lighter. It was meant to be a punishment that you'd walk away from. They would take something softer, thicker, that wouldn't do great internal damage or external damage, but reminiscent of what we might call a good switching. If you ever went out and had to pick your own switch, well, it probably served you in life, honestly. But you understand that was meant as a punishment, a deterrent, to teach somebody to do better. The other 2 types of floggings were not meant to be instructional. They were meant to be purely punitive, and the worst was meant to be done to someone when you knew you were going to execute them because it was very unlikely they were ever going to be able to live through it. Now, of those 3 types of Roman beatings, what is described here is that worst kind. What they beat Jesus with was affectionately called a cat of 9 tails, or something very similar to it. It was an instrument that had strips of leather attached to some form of handle, and on the end of those strips of leather were pieces of iron, pieces of bone, pieces of sharpened stone, that the intent was to not just beat someone, but to beat them potentially to death. And if not to death, you beat them to the verge of death. Josephus, one of the first century historians, witnessed a few floggings. He said that the rib cage was often visible in the aftermath, that skin hung off in ribbons, that you could see kidneys revealed. I'll be honest with you, every single time I talk about the crucifixion or Jesus' beating, I'm tempted to do exactly what John did here and just say they flogged him. But I'm describing it to you in greater detail, not to sensationalize it, but because in their day, everybody knew what this meant. When John described flogging, he did not have to put a mental image into anyone's head. They knew what this looked like. In the century before Jesus was born, there was a Roman soldier by the name of Spartacus that led a rebellion. And when they finally squashed that rebellion, there were 6,000 Roman slaves who were captured. And they crucified all 6,000 of those slaves and lined them along the Appian Way for over 100 miles. So, hear me. I'm really not trying to sensationalize this. But I am telling you, they didn't have to describe this to these people. They knew what it meant. We don't. And so I want you to get the mental image of what is happening here. They're beating him in such a way that they do not expect him to live through it. And friends, Pilate is doing this when he's already declared he's innocent. I find no guilt in him. And he beat him anyway. You'd think that leaving him actively dying from trauma and blood loss, and hear me, even if he hadn't been crucified, the likelihood that this would have killed him alone is really, really high, because the smallest of things caused infection. But as if that weren't enough, as if enough trauma had not been inflicted, they weren't done. Look at verse 2. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. This is intended to be mocking, of course. The crown, likely from either the date palm or an acacia tree. There's no specific description of what was used here. But the reason that those things were used is because the thorns on them were from 4 to 6 inches long, incredibly hard, and they were doing this not to just pierce his scalp with the thorns, but because kings in those days, especially Roman Caesars, would often have crowns that had shooting gold filaments coming out of them, supposed to look like an aura coming from their head. And so what they're doing here is taking thorns and mocking the look of a Roman crown. What they may or may not have realized, I doubt these Roman soldiers realized it, that those thorns in themselves were an illustration of the curse that had fallen on the earth because of Adam's sin. When God spoke the curse over Adam, he said, thorns and thistles are what the earth will bring forth. And the consequence of sin was that thorns like that existed. And these Roman soldiers took the very consequence of sin and crammed it into his scalp so that he would be mocked as a king. Probably one of the higher officials within the Roman guard had a fancier robe. Purple and blue, for that matter, were very expensive dyes because they required shellfish to be made. And so they didn't have the means to get that as easily. And so those dyes were incredibly expensive and normally reserved for royalty. And one of the higher Roman officials, no doubt, had one of those robes, and they draped it over Jesus. They came up to him in verse 3 saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Cruelty mingled with indignity at the hands of those that he was coming to save. I think Pilate there's not a lot of description in the Bible about what his real motivation was. He was a politician at his core. And not to judge every politician, but very often it's what is expedient for them to maintain their position that inspires them to make their choices. And in his case, he was a politician to his core. Might be one of the reasons that we don't fully understand him. But I think that in Pilate's mind, he thought this beating, this mocking, this indignity, this cruelty would be sufficient to appease the crowd that was calling for his death. He'd show the crowd this brutalized Christ, thinking that they would be pacified. Because that's what he was really interested in. He was interested in pacifying the crowd. He wasn't interested in justice. He wasn't interested in maintaining law and order. He just wanted to have peace. He wasn't interested in what was right or wrong. He just wanted the crowd to go away. So without backbone, I think he made a final effort to placate this mob. Verse 4 says, Pilate went out and said to them, "See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." What a horrible human being. Beat him for no reason. He's a coward and a scoundrel. But at least he's sticking to his conviction that he found no guilt in him. He's saying, I just did this to this man I believe to be innocent. Is it enough? Is it enough? Verse 5 says, so Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. One of the other gospel writers said they gave him a reed as a scepter. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him. Crucify him." He's like, don't stop yet. Don't stop short. Keep pressing into the goal. We want him dead, not just dying. Seeing him beaten and bloodied and humiliated was not enough. It's a level of hatred that boggles the imagination for someone who fed the people who were hungry, who healed the people who were sick, who said, allow the little children to come. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him. I find no guilt in him." It's as if he's saying, if you want him dead so bad, go do it yourself. Listen, he had the legal authority to set him free, and if he did so, the religious leaders could have done nothing else to him. So when he made this statement, he made this statement knowing that they couldn't take him and kill him. I've already mentioned this before, but let me remind you. Only the Roman government had taken the right of capital punishment away from the Jews. They could not kill someone for any reason. If they wanted capital punishment, they had to bring that person to the Romans, and the Romans would carry it out. So when Pilate said this, he said it knowing. He's basically looking at him and saying, if you want him dead so bad, break the law and do it yourself. The Jews answered him, verse 7, "We have a law, and according to the law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. It's an interesting word there, afraid. Afraid possibly because there's no easy answer at this point. I tell my girls all the time that life is going to have moments in it where you don't get to choose between easy and hard. All you have is hard and hard, and you have to pick your hard. He is in a position like this. He was either going to have to release Jesus and anger the crowd, or be a coward and pervert justice under compulsion. He wasn't wanting to do this. He was letting people twist his arm. He probably didn't like it. He didn't like being treated this way. Now, without question, there was a sinful way to proceed and a righteous way to proceed, but that didn't concern him. He was just choosing his brand of hard. Verse 9 says, he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "Will you not speak to me?" The Greek sets this up pretty interesting because that's a great translation in English. But what he really did is he looked at him and he said, "Me? You won't speak to me?" It's as if Pilate is saying, "Who do you think you are to not answer my questions?" Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, "You have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." That one, it said, "He who delivered you," probably a reference to Caiaphas, the high priest, but it's not clear. But he does make it clear, this one thing that I told you 2 weeks ago in the garden when he prayed, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." Jesus at no point in time was under the compulsion of men. He could have walked away from this at any moment. Pilate was not the one who had ultimate authority here. Whatever authority he had was granted to him by a sovereign God. Jesus could have walked away from this at this moment and healed himself. But Jesus was here willingly. If you ever hear somebody say that the cross is an example of cosmic child abuse, just recognize that has not read the story right. Jesus is doing this willingly. He's the one who's really in control. He's enduring what he's enduring, not under the compulsion of men, but by choice and sovereign decision. Now notice one last thing about Pilate. Verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend." Now, there was an official title that was granted to people considered highly loyal within Roman culture. They were called the friend of Caesar. And of course, they, had an obviously, Roman descriptive for that, but it translates the friend of Caesar. So what they're doing here is they're having a play on words there. They're saying, listen, if you don't hand him over, you're not a friend of Caesar. If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Now, I want to be very clear about something right here. These people hated Caesar. Multiple rebellions were formed during Jesus' lifetime. In fact, when Jesus was a young boy, hundreds of people were crucified in Jerusalem because they hated Caesar. There was a rebellion that started up. They have no love for Caesar, but they're making this ridiculous statement that in itself is blasphemous. The irony here is so thick. They're accusing him of blasphemy and then turning around and saying, "But Caesar is our king." It's more than just a veiled threat that they're making, because any enemy of Caesar was under the threat of being killed at any moment. But here's this last thing I want you to notice about Pilate, because we've looked at a lot of things that he's done to this point. But notice with me the difference between Pilate when he's in and Pilate when he's out. Here's what I mean by that. When Pilate is inside his house, interviewing Jesus, talking with Jesus, looking upon Jesus, his heart and his mind tell him, let this man go, he's innocent. But when Pilate is out, when he's out looking at the crowd, when he's out seeing the scores of people and the religious leaders, when he's out listening to the people make their case, he's an entirely different man. And he placates to them and he attempts to pacify them. When he's in, he knows what's right. He knows what he ought to do. He knows the path that he ought to take. But when he gets out, he behaves entirely differently. Brothers, sisters, how easy is it for us to follow his pattern and to be in a place like this? And hold our hands up in worship, sing songs that confess his lordship, make decisions in the moment that says, oh, we're going to live for him and glorify him. And then the moment we get out, the influence of the world, the people we come in contact with, the pressures that exist there have a tendency to at least encourage us to live just like Pilate did. There's something to be learned from that. Because it's good for us to come to a place like this, to come into a place like this, come into a small group or even into a prayer closet, a prayer time, studying the Bible for yourself, speaking to the Lord on your own. It's good to come into moments like that, but let's be very clear. You come into moments like that to be strengthened and edified and built up so that when you go out, you still act like who you are in. He didn't. He was a chameleon, and he was a cautionary tale. History says that he committed suicide. It's not in the Bible. He's going to be deposed in 37 AD. He's got a few years left. He's going to be deposed. He's going to be kicked out of Palestine altogether, and he is going to be so despondent from that he's going to kill himself. Same thing that Judas did. So there's a high price to pay for being one way in and one way out. But the one way that he was in was never about faith. He never crossed the threshold into belief. Beginning in verse 13. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in an Aramaic, Gabbatha. It is basically not a throne per se, but more like a bench like a judge would sit on. Is a place where his office made official declarations. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, that's lunchtime. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." He's mad at them. He's mocking them just as much as he's mocking Jesus when he says that. They cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." The very blasphemy that they're wanting to kill him for, they cry out with their own tongue. So he delivered him, that is Jesus, over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus. Pilate sat down in the ruling seat of his office and pronounced judgment that he knew was unjust. Pray you're able to hear me though. One day, Jesus is going to sit down at a different seat of judgment. And when he sits down at that seat of judgment, every judgment he makes will be just. It will be final. And there will be no one to argue against it. When you see him submit himself to this ridiculous man, it's such a horrible picture. It's a sin beyond imagination. Yet, as I pointed out 3 weeks ago now, and highlighted again today already, Jesus was not compelled by man to do any of it. He was able at any moment to put an end to it, but he didn't, so that you and I could be forgiven. As I've studied over this for the last couple of weeks, I haven't been able to get Isaiah 53 out of my mind. If you were at Hope's funeral yesterday, I preached briefly out of that passage because I haven't been able to get past it. For those of you who were here yesterday, then you're going to have to forgive the little bit of repetition that you hear today. But Isaiah 53 speaks so directly to what we're talking about today. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to go and read the whole of it today. It's a prophetic poem. It's written 750 years before the events that we're reading about this morning. But they describe these events in amazing detail. And so I want you to listen as I read this prophet's description. The truth be known, the whole of the chapter is relevant, but I'm just going to read 4 verses, beginning in verse 3. And as I read it, I'm going to read it emphasizing what I believe to be the real good news about this passage. Because the real good news in this passage is the way the prophet uses pronouns, particularly how he juxtaposes those pronouns. So follow along with me and endure with me as I emphasize what I think is most important here. Isaiah 53 verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, as one whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Friends, that is profound good news for everyone who puts faith in Jesus Christ. Because let's be very, very clear. We deserved to be despised and rejected, not just by men, but by God. We should have been sorrowful and full of grief, too pitiful to be looked at because of our sinful state. We should have no esteem from anyone afforded to us. We should carry the burden of our own grief and sorrow because we brought it on ourselves as a consequence of our own sins. We should have been justly stricken and smitten by God Himself and afflicted for our own rebellion. We should be pierced. We should be crushed. We should be chastised for our own sin and left wounded and without peace. But God, through Jesus, willingly, lovingly stepped between us and the wrath of God and juxtaposed it all, swapped it around, turned it around, took it all upon himself and suffered everything that we rightfully deserved. And then, if that weren't good enough by itself, he turned around and he gave us things like righteous standing before God and peace and healing. He gave us things that only he deserved. Friends, that was what Pilate was looking at in those moments as he rejected the truth of who Jesus was, ignored justice, and killed the Savior. But before we're too quick to judge him, I want you to remember verse 6 from Isaiah 53. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. In the face of all that God did for us through Jesus, our response to that initially is to go astray. It's the common thread of all mankind. But the sacrifice of Jesus was so powerful, it was so sufficient that had Pilate repented and believed, he would have been saved. The Roman who picked up the whip and beat him, had he repented and believed, would have been saved. The one who held the hammer and drove the nails, had he repented and believed, he would have been saved. Hear me. This man who bears this distinction of being the only man mentioned in the Apostles' Creed, mentioned for dubious reasons, mentioned because of his cowardice, mentioned because of his lack of character, mentioned because he presided over the greatest perversion and miscarriage of justice that has ever happened in all of human history. Even Pilate would have been saved had he repented and believed. Hear me, friends. I don't know how poorly you view yourself as a sinner, but I want you to know the blood was sufficient to wash Pilate clean. It's sufficient to wash us clean. And that, my friends, is some really good news. It's good news for all of us sheep who have gone astray. That Jesus really did suffer all these things because he was taking on himself in these moments the consequences that we deserved, so that we could, in the millennia that follow, the eternity that follow, receive the benefits that only he deserves. And that's the truth of the gospel.